Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed the break and the catch up with your fellow advocates. So disability advocates support people with disabilities to support their rights to access services and be included in the community. These rights are laid out in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Yet we find that discrimination, violence, and neglect is a much more usual experience for people with disabilities than full inclusion. Why aren't the rights of people with disabilities embedded effectively in our universal service systems and mainstream policies? What needs to happen for full inclusion to be real and ensure that the lives of people with disability are free from abuse and exploitation? We have a very special guest here with us today, someone well known to all of you here. Please give a very warm welcome back to Leah Van Poppel.
Thank you for that warm welcome, Melissa. For those of you who don't know me so well, and it is a delight and a privilege to be in a room with so many who do, my name is Leah. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a board member at the National Disability Insurance Agency. My role on the board is a little bit unique. I'm a board member who has all of the same duties and responsibilities of any kind of board member on a government agency or body. But I'm also on the board because I chair the Independent Advisory Council, which is a bit like Chris was describing VDAC earlier, the Victorian Disability Advisory Council. The Independent Advisory Council is not part of government. It's there to tell us how the NDIS could be better and how the lives of people with disabilities could be better. I'm here to talk to you about what needs to happen to make sure that people with disability have inclusion across the systems that support all of us to have good lives. Before I do that, I'm going to just start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting here today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And also to acknowledge that we are coming together from lands across Victoria and maybe outside of Victoria that are owned, that have strong connection back to Aboriginal people. I live, work and play on Gunai land in eastern Victoria. We can't talk about changing mainstream systems and creating greater inclusion for people with disabilities without beginning to talk about the NDIS, because the NDIS has such a strong connection back to what mainstream systems do or don't do for people with disabilities. When the NDIS first came into being 10 years ago, people weren't talking about it as the only lifeboat in the ocean. They were talking about the fact that there were no lifeboats. People with disability across this country were very often left in the ocean drowning. We know that because the Productivity Commission looked into the state of disability supports over a decade ago, and they described them as broken. They said that it was a lottery to get support, depending on where you lived and what kind of disability you had. And they also said that without support, people with disability sometimes got sick and died. That's a pretty fundamental failure of our society. One of the basic things that a lifeboat is meant to do is to make sure that people actually have a life. And that is one of the things that the NDIS has started to try to address. Back 10 years ago, Here in Victoria, the system was very different to how it is now. Some people got no support at all. Some people would get support after being in a long waiting list. They would get support from a service provider that they hadn't chosen, and they had no choice about what those services might look like, what the supports might be, and who might give them. Some people were able to get individualised support packages, a little bit like what the NDIS provides now, but there was only a certain amount of money in the bucket for those kind of supports. So if you wanted to get support for the first time, or you needed more support than you already had, you had to wait for government to put more money in the bucket, which didn't happen very often, or you had to wait for somebody else who was getting support from that system to move out of the state or to die. It is a profound victory for disability rights that we as a country said that people with disabilities should not continue to drown in this way. It is a profound victory that we as a country decided that people with disability should have the same basic rights as others. Like many of you in this room, I've come from an advocacy background, and I too want to make sure that our society gets better and better at including people with disabilities. We still have an incredibly long way to go, but we cannot chart that course without stopping and recognising that what was controversial 10 years ago, the idea that people with disability would have a fundamental right to something as simple as more than 3 showers in a week, is now not controversial. We often in advocacy keep fighting for things to be better, and so we should. But at this point, 10 years out from the start of the NDIS, it is also appropriate for us to reflect on that victory and what it has brought us. What's it brought us? When I said earlier that a lifeboat is designed to give life, to make sure that people have the very basic element of survival, that they don't drown, we see some of this in the way that the scheme is providing outcomes to people with disabilities who are in the scheme, and that's an important bit. Not everybody with a disability is in the NDIS. In terms of health and wellbeing, people who come into the NDIS over time say to us that their health and wellbeing is getting better because they're in the scheme. We know that because we ask them the question, but we also know that because we see it in other ways. People who are in the scheme and have a disability are more likely after 3 years of being in the scheme to be seeing a GP that is a regular GP. They're more likely to have fewer visits to hospital in a 12-month period. Those things tell us that there are some signs of improvement. But again, we know that that improvement is not happening for everybody. I stand here on this stage with the name Anne-Marie Smith ringing in my ears. We all know that having support, having a plan, having money in your package, even having a worker come into your home and support you is no guarantee of health and well-being. And we all know that the picture behind that is very, very complicated. Why is it that Some people with disability find that their supports do enable better health and well-being, while others don't. It might be because of disability type. It might be because they have an intersectional identity. That's a bit of jargon, but it means things like being Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer, or asexual. It means being from a culturally and linguistically diverse background. Those things can make it harder for supports to appear and to do the right things that we want them to do. We also know that people with disabilities face other challenges in accessing supports. I'm an NDIS board member, but I'm standing here and saying to you, there are still people who find it hard to get into the NDIS, even when they need it. And there are people who find that their plans don't work for them. That needs to be addressed. We know that there are people who fall through the gaps created when there's a line drawn around what disability supports will provide and what the health system will provide. We know that there are some people who have their health and well-being affected by broader issues. If you're in housing that doesn't work for you, it can sometimes make you sicker, for example. When we think about where people with disabilities stand in terms of the broader population of Australian people who might be disabled but don't have access to the NDIS, or people who don't have a disability at all, the story is also complicated. People with disabilities are far more likely to have a GP, to take my earlier example, than the broader Australian population. People with disabilities are also, even though this is improving, still far more likely to need to go to a hospital over a 12-month period. And people with disabilities in the NDIS are far more likely, or far less likely, sorry, to say that their health and well-being is good or excellent than the general population. So we know we have a long way to go, and we know that this is a very, very complicated picture. And across all of the areas of life for people with disability, the same story crops up again and again. If we think about employment, we know that some people, particularly some young people and people from different disability types, might be starting to make inroads into getting jobs more often. But that's not true for everybody. That's partly about the NDIS making sure people have employment supports in their plans when they need them. It's partly about the Disability Employment Services system. And it's also for people who are working in places like Australian Disability Enterprises, sometimes called sheltered workshops. It can be about knowing that you have choice to try something different and then really being given the chance and opportunity to do so. So this looks like a really, really complicated picture. We know we have some information in statistics in the NDIS and outside the NDIS. We have a lot of numbers, but those numbers only tell us a part of the picture. We cannot work for the right kind of change if we don't really truly understand the why. We need to be able to pull together information from the NDIS and from state systems to get a full picture. And then we need to ask the disability community including people with disabilities, family members and carers and advocates, why the picture looks like it does, because lived experience is what will tell us what's really at the heart of what's going on. And then we need to act on that information. And the way that we act matters. We need to make sure that people with disability and the disability community are able to check that we understand what the problems are and that we're working in the right way to resolve them. That is sometimes talked about now as co-design. In the NDIS, it's now in the law that the agency has to use co-design where it can to try and make things better. But that's not true for every part of the system. So if we are asking for better information, if we are asking for true change, we need to be making sure that disabled voices are at the heart of every step of the way. The system, the answer to the question of what we need to do to promote inclusion is also really complicated when you start to think about what rights look like. The UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disability drives a lot of the change happening everywhere across this country. Within the UN Convention, people who think a lot about human rights will tell you that there are two kinds of rights described. The kind of rights where you have them from the start of your life and nobody should ever be able to take those rights away. Those are things like the right to vote, the right to life, the right to get a fair trial. Then there are things which should progressively get better. So your right to get an education, your right to have a job, your right to choose where you live and to be able to get good services. Over time, those should get better. We know that there are lots of different policies out there and lots of different programs trying to work together to progress the rights of people with disabilities. We have, of course, the NDIS, but we also have the Australian Disability Strategy and the State Disability Plan, which Chris was talking about earlier today. We have Victorian human rights instruments. Across all of these different layers of law and policy, we need to be having a really deep conversation about how and how quickly we progress those rights in a coordinated way that brings the voice of people with disability forward. It is one thing to take a journey to pull somebody out of the water and drag them into a lifeboat so that they can survive. It is an entirely different journey to bring people with disabilities to safe land so that they can stand alongside other citizens in this country. And it is an entirely different thing again to do that, to take that journey while allowing people with disabilities to steer the boat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leah. That was inspiring. Well done. I think we've got enough time for a couple of questions. So we've got a few roving mics. So if you want to put your hand up.
Yes, I can see one on the far side. Keep your hand up, please.
Can you hear that okay?
Yeah, I think so.
I'm sneaking up behind you. Here we go.
Thank you. Hi, Leah. It's Veronica. It's great to hear from you. One of the things that I would like to ask about is access to assistive technology under the NDIS. whenever we need a piece of technology, for example, if we need a talking microwave or talking kitchen scales, we have to justify why we need a piece of assistive technology when we know that our disabilities are permanent. Is there going to be better policies around this so that we don't constantly have to justify why we need something when we already know that our disabilities are permanent?
Thank you, Veronica. That's an excellent question. I think putting aside my board hat and talking with my independent advisory council hat on, the council has said over a long period of time that people with disability should be able to get the kind of supports that help them to be best included in the community, because that's one of the things that will keep us safest and free from or less likely to experience abuse and neglect. Assistive technology does that for many, many people who are in the scheme. When we talk about policies and changes to policy, right now is a little bit of a tricky time because we are about to hear from both the Disability Royal Commission, who are handing down their final report to government in just, I think, a few weeks' time now. 29th of September is the date that's in my head. And the review into the NDIS, which is reporting to government in October. We hope that both of those very important inquiries will give us some direction at the NDIS about ways to make the system better for people with disabilities, including with things like assistive technology.
And we've got another question here, Leah, from Denise Boyd.
Thank you. My name is Denise Boyd and I work for Star Victoria. We support people with intellectual disability across Victoria. My question, Leah, and thank you for your presentation today, is why do parents with intellectual disability find it so difficult to get the supports that one would expect they could legitimately access through the NDIS to enable them to parent their children safely and successfully instead of having them taken into care? Thank you.
So I think I heard most of your question, which was about why people with intellectual disability find it difficult to get supports for them to live independently. Is that right?
No, it was about parenting support.
Oh, parenting
so parents with intellectual disability, which is a right to be a parent, and then it's a legitimate goal under the NDIA legislation, and yet it is very difficult for some parents to get the supports they need through their plan in order to parent successfully.
I think this is when I talked about the Independent Advisory Council earlier, the Independent Advisory Council gives advice to the board and the minister. It's formal advice, and under the Act, under the law that sets up the NDIS, they have to take on board that advice and listen to us. They might not always have to agree. One of the pieces of advice that we gave a couple of years ago was about exactly this topic. The Independent Advisory Council has some groups that sit under it, one of which is an intellectual disability reference group, and that group brought up this issue with us and said, too many parents with intellectual disability are having their children taken away just because of their disabilities. And the NDIS and the state and territory child protection systems are not working well together to solve this problem. So we gave the NDIS a whole bunch of advice about what to do to resolve this. And the agency provided us with a response about what they would do. Within that, we had asked them to look at things like making sure that when it was likely that a parent with an intellectual disability or a parent with any kind of disability really was at risk of having their child taken away, that plans could be done quickly and in coordination We asked for things like the NDIS and the Department of Social Services to think about maybe having parenting supports for people with intellectual disability, but just give general information. So maybe not as part of a plan, but as through the community, and to really prioritise that. That advice was given a couple of years ago, and we are in the process of tracking all of our advice from the past few years. We've been giving advice over the course of 10 years, and we really look at the most recent pieces of advice to track them. We have not recently had the agency in front of us to talk about that piece of advice, but I believe it's coming up soon, and would be really happy to connect with you or anyone else who's interested in hearing more about what the agency says it's done and what it plans to do.
Leah, no more questions from the floor.
Thank you very much, Leah. Have a round of applause for Leah. Fantastic, fantastic presentation. Such a privilege.